major theme, many fronts, veterans, war, and the humanities. I hope you'll excuse me. I wrote everything out. I get very nervous, so it'll save you time because I'm a nervous talker. I want to thank the Dean for her support and encouragement in championing these new centers and initiatives. Tony Payne, who's around in the back, for his work arranging this event, and everybody else in the Dean's office for their aid. And obviously I want to thank our panelists next to me, although not now all next to me because one's right there. Right back there, our state's poet laureate, Todd Marshall, who's took the lead really in creating this center. And then we have, again, working from the far left down, Lisa Silvestri, a professor in communications who's written a fascinating book on social media and the military, friended at the front, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. And as I'll discuss momentarily, has been instrumental in helping give the direction to our first year, our theme of veterans. Anna Marie Medina in psychology, whose work doing oral histories with veterans goes back a number of years, and who I think shows how much the humanities and the social sciences can do to better people's lives. And Kathleen Jeffs from our dynamic theater department, who is really putting the public in our humanities efforts with the future production of student-written performances drawn from those veteran oral histories. These three, and that one, represent the best of higher education and the humanities. They've dedicated themselves to, invested in themselves in, and often exhausted themselves on projects that bring Gonzaga's resources and our expertise into the community and actually better people's lives. And we're lucky to have them here. So before I begin discussing the center, I want to turn it to Todd, who will speak briefly about the origin of the center and probably tell us a little bit about Posey, since that's his job, his mission.
I'm sitting back there for a reason because at 11:38 I need to go and intercept a campus tour with a barbaric yacht. And so I want to be in position to duck out in a civil manner. So I'm really happy to be here this morning. I'm really happy that the Center for Public Humanities has come to fruition this year. We spent quite a bit of time last year coming up with a plan for the center, and a number of people contributed. I certainly appreciate the Dean's help in getting things going. I think that perhaps a poem will speak to my involvement and my enthusiasm for this as much as anything else. And it's a poem by William Cross Williams called The Self. The poem is a discipline. What you need to sober you is what you have, your children. Let them, children, teach you the peach flowers, the great globular locks curling pathetically about their eyes and temples, their rosy cheeks. The poem laid crudely, delicately before you. Now the bridge for that poem to my interest in public humanities is through Humanities Washington and their amazing primetime family reading program. If you're not familiar with that program, it's an outreach program connected to getting kids interested in libraries early on. And I participated in that program, and it had a very profound impact on me. I think that in my vision, the university has to be facing outward. We have to be connecting with a variety of different publics in as many ways as possible. That particular outreach was connected to work with kids and their families and connected with literacy. I think this year's program focusing on a number of different projects, but primarily veterans experience is going to be wonderful. And Brian's going to tell you about some of those events. If you're not familiar with Humanities Washington and Arts Washington, they're the two organizations that sponsor the Poet Laureate position in the state. And I think that Humanities Washington especially will serve as a wonderful partner for our Center for Public Humanities going forward. But you might spend time peeking at their presence online. Humanities Washington offers programs that serve over 250,000 people in our state. They're all free. They're connected to all of the ways that we can think about being human. The Poet Laureate position is one that they sponsor. They do think and drink talks where the community engages in discussions of hot button issues in a civilized manner instead of shouting at one another. And they do a speakers bureau that offers wonderful stuff to a variety of organizations in our state. So if you have questions or if you're interested in the Poet Laureate program, wapoetlaureate.org is my website. I am mandated to do social media stuff, and so I tweet, and I've actually have some fun with that. And I keep a blog, and I write about my journeys, the wonderful people I encounter in the state. I've done something like 7 or 8 dozen events since I started in February. I actually flew from Seattle this morning, where I did an event last night, and I'm flying back to Seattle to do an event there tomorrow. So it's a very busy position, but it's incredibly rewarding. And I think that driving to an event on Thursday in Chelan, I may have had what could qualify as an epiphany, where I was just so happy and felt so fulfilled driving to go and talk about the arts to this small community in Central Washington, and share a little bit about poetry and what it's meant to me, and hear from people about what poetry means to them. I think that's a really crucial part about humanities outreach programming, the hearing part, the listening part. So check out the social media stuff. Don't think me rude at 11:39, and enjoy the rest of the panel.
I have to work with him. He comes up, he has poems memorized, and I have to write up my thing. It's embarrassing. All right. So today, I want to discuss briefly the mission of the center, but also to advocate for the humanities. I believe the humanities, the study of what makes us human and of what gives us of human life meaning, be it ethical, spiritual, or aesthetic, is the heart of the Jesuit education. And our university should make it a practice to articulate that. This, in a nutshell, is why I am pleased to direct the new Center for Public Humanities. Of course, before all else, one of my most essential tasks is to promote the great efforts that are already going on Gonzaga's campus, in the classroom, in our faculty studies, like these 3, and perhaps in the field. I've been talking to colleagues for these past months, and I see some of them here, and there is incredible research and passionate teaching across our disciplines. And just a cursory glance at my notes from my short time on this job reveals stunning projects, including but not limited to Matt Rood, our ceramicist, who has developed an environmentally sound brick material, which is very cool. Charlie Papatone, who's right here, Cooney Theater again, who had his first short film screen at Cannes. Andy Goldman, who has, with Paul Menegera, put together an extraordinary museum exhibition, which I hope you all have a chance to get to in the Junk. It's fantastic. It's the best museum exhibition I've seen in the state of Washington in my 10 years here. Todd Marshall, again, our state's poet laureate, who embarrasses me at every turn. And not to mention so many of our scholars, like Lisa Silvestri, Emily Clark, Matthew Ridge, Kevin O'Connor, and on with new books or books on the immediate horizon. These are all incredible faculty members. But all that notwithstanding, I've been here for 10 years, and I've heard again and again, and maybe some of you have said this, I would have gone to that thing, but I didn't know it was going on. Or I didn't know that person was working on that project. The center is hoping to become a clearinghouse for us all, to help involve larger audiences on and off campus, and to facilitate connections between enterprises that might not otherwise connect. As importantly, the center seeks to bring greater public awareness to all the work in programming in the humanities, and to remind the public how important these disciplines are. We live in an era when STEM has dominated discussions of higher education, and not coincidentally, we also hear repeatedly about the so-called crisis in the humanities. Have any of you heard about this, the crisis in the humanities? I take this phrase to mean that we have lost a sense of the value of the humanities. That word, though, value, is peculiar. It goes back all the way to the 12th century in France, and has had not 2 entirely reconcilable definitions for almost 900 years. On the one hand, a monetary worth, and on the other hand, a worth measured in esteem. Too often then, when we discuss the value of education, we find ourselves speaking at cross purposes. On the one hand, how will this pay off in salary down the line? And on the other hand, to what degree will it provide foundations for what antiquity called the good life? Perhaps the crisis in the humanities corresponds with the loss of that second sense, the good life. After all, in 1968, 86% of students said that finding a life philosophy was very important in college. Now that is down to 51%. Conversely, in 1970, only 36% of students said being very well off financially was essential. Today, the number is 76%. We have, I trust, a great many parents here, so I want to speak at least for a moment to you. I am keenly aware that the monetary sense of value often supersedes the more aspirational one, especially with tuitions ever on the rise. Many humanists will try to argue students, parents, or society back to that second definition, bellowing that the unexamined life is not worth living, or as he just did, that we should sound our barbaric yawps from the rooftops of the world, or their carpe diems, or their gather ye rosebuds, or whatever else. And I'll do that too. I will. But first, a basic fact about monetary value. An American with a BA in any major will, on average, out-earn one with a high school degree by $1 million in his or her lifetime. Any BA, any major. In rawest terms, a college degree remains valuable. That said, I have this conversation every semester. Maybe you've had this too, Todd, perhaps also. Students who come into our office and say, I want to major in X, but I'm going to major in Y. And X is something that appears to have little functional value, and Y is something that is obviously pre-professional. I think this is tragic, and I'll tell you why. First and foremost, as I tell my students, the word school derives from the Greek skole. Don't know if that's the pronunciation. Don't speak Greek. It looks like it on the page, meaning leisure. I'm a reader, not a speaker. I want to stress, because the work we do is easy. It's not leisurely, but because these are years. That these are years to take time, extended time to find yourself, if you'll excuse the awful cliche, to consider what truly matters to you. After all, college is 4 years. If you live to be 80 years old, that's 5% of your life. It shouldn't be treated as preparation for life to come. It is your life. And you'll have to forgive me slipping into the carpe diem, and I promised you I wouldn't do that yet, but I did. More practically, this decision is predicated on a misapprehension, and it returns me to that idea of the crisis in the humanities. If there is a crisis in the humanities, it is a crisis in confidence. In a large 2013 study, 93% of employers surveyed said that, and this is a quote, capacity to think critically, communicate clearly, and solve complex problems is more important than undergraduate major. These are the faculties we develop through the study of the humanities, the skills that give our students flexibility of mind to take on any challenge in an age when millennials will, on average, have 4 job changes before the age of 32. I suspect it is the development of these skills as well that accounts for the fact that English majors dramatically outscore chemistry, biochemistry, and biology majors on the MCATs, and humanities students across the board outscore business students on the GMATs. Indeed, one older study shows that the major with the highest success rate for medical school is music. So when your child says she wants to be majoring in clarinet, and you get all freaked out, and some of you may have a fainting spell, just remember what that child may be saying to you is, I'm going to be the next great neurosurgeon. I do not want to belabor the point, but I feel it incumbent upon me to emphasize that choosing a major in a humanities discipline is not to forfeit the likelihood of a lucrative career. After all, the median salary in 2013 for a business grad was $65,000. For a history major, it was $54,000. The difference is not as great as what we might expect. And what is most amazing is that business leaders, deans of medical schools with whom I've spoken, even politicians, if you listen carefully, are telling us the same thing. We need people with the skills derived from the humanities more than ever in this era of change. As David Kearns, the former CEO of Xerox, says, this is a quote from David Kearns, the only education that prepares us for change is liberal education. In periods of change, narrow specialization condemns us to inflexibility, precisely what we do not need. When I arrived at Gonzaga, the university's motto is educating the people the world needs most. The Jesuits have sought for centuries to educate the whole person, pure personalis. I believe we are special at Gonzaga for asking our students to think deeply about why we do what we do. The philosopher Immanuel Kant argued education should be directed at the world as it should be, not just as it is. In my most aspirational moments, like Todd, I truly believe the empathy, the awareness of difference, the deepening of our sense of our shared humanity can, as Robert Kennedy was fond of quoting, make gentle the life of this world. I am not naive, though, and I would not naively argue that the humanities are a guarantor of humaneness. I also reflect on Joseph Conrad's mad, predatory curse, whom all Europe contributed to the making. The values, cultures, histories, and ideas that make up our disciplines are a subject of human folly. a subject of human folly and corruption is the scientific discoveries that produced the atomic bomb or VX gas. Still, I look to moments when humanities managed to endure through brutality and consider how we must hold fast those examples. In lines that did not make the original English translation of Night, Elie Wiesel writes sorrowfully, "Books no longer have the power they once did. Those who kept silent yesterday will remain silent tomorrow." Pessimistic as he may be, Wiesel strikes me as challenging us to prove him wrong. The first step, then, to speaking out when before we were silent is to turn back to the books that tell us what to say and how best to live. I know I'm not alone in my faith in the humanities, that the humanities can create deep meaning in our lives and can perhaps as well provide us with cautions against our worst failings. This belief grounds this year's theme, Many Fronts, Veterans, War, and the Humanities, which I want to turn to briefly before we hear more from Lisa, Anna Marie, and Kathleen. The credit for this theme actually belongs with them. When I was first named director, Lisa was the first person to write me, and she said, "I'm working on this project. I want you to help me." And I said, "You're helping me." And then she introduced me to the projects that they were working on, and there was our theme. So really, they're the ones who came up with the theme. And in addition, the National Endowment for the Humanities and Humanities Washington, as Todd mentioned, have long been working with veterans on various programs. So we're hoping to coordinate with them. But the more I've read, the more I've come to see how intertwined has been the story of American higher education and our veterans going back to the GI Bill in 1944, and at the same time how vexed the relationship has been. After all, Harvard and other elite institutions opposed the college provision, worried precisely about the influx of diversity, ethnic, gender, racial, religious, and class. At the same time, expectations were low. Few thought many veterans would bother to take the opportunity to go to school. But of course, within a year of the war's end in 1946, nearly half of all college students were veterans. And from that World War II generation, we of course have not only had presidents and business leaders, but also great artists and writers who have colored our century. Romare Beard, James Dickey, Alan Capro, Ellsworth Kelly, Jack Kerouac, Frank O'Hara, Robert Rauschenberg, all GI Bill. It's demonstrable that the expanded presence of veterans in our colleges and universities helped create what has been called the American century. Times obviously have changed, as have the opportunities afforded by the GI Bill. Still, when I began conversations with various offices on campus involved in veterans issues, I was stunned to learn that there are at the moment over 230 students on the GI Bill at Gonzaga right now. These students have perhaps not always been paid adequate attention, either in addressing their needs or in lauding their abilities, their experience, and all the gifts they bring to our university. Unfortunately, nationally, half of veterans who enter college will not finish. To that end, we have worked this year to create a series of programs that give our veterans some proper attention. And further, we have begun work with experts and local groups to create ongoing projects to continue this work beyond the brackets of the university semester and year. Before I turn to my colleagues who will discuss their work with veterans, let me talk briefly about 3 events related to our theme, 2 upcoming and 1 that just occurred. On November 14th, we will host the chairman of the National Endowment of the Humanities, William Bro Adams. Dr. Adams was an infantryman in Vietnam, and he has said that the experience helped inspire him to return to college to study philosophy. He went on to get a PhD in what has to be the coolest PhD ever, the history of consciousness. It's Santa Cruz, right? Isn't that correct? Santa Cruz? And then he became the long-serving president of Colby College. He's going to discuss in part what the humanities can do for veterans. And to my knowledge, no NEH chair has ever visited Eastern Washington in the history of the NEH. And this one has chosen to come to Gonzaga University. So this is a very momentous occasion for us. Then on February 6th, we will be hosting the National Book Award-winning novelist Tim O'Brien, another Vietnam veteran, who will be reading in the Henningsen Center. There are a number of other programs, and I encourage you to look at our website to see the schedule. But finally, this past week, we hosted our first major event, actually, one that represents what we seek to accomplish. I was honored to be able to help organize a forum at a local community center, in which we hosted the novelist Whitney Terrell, who just published The Good Lieutenant, a novel that The Guardian actually calls the best book of the Bush War years. And it's based on his time embedded in Iraq. Along with Whitney, 3 of our student veterans who had read the book talked about their experiences and how much a novel can help those of us who have never been to war understand it. Fundamental to the conversation was how the humanities, narrative, ethics, history, cultural comprehension can bring together soldiers and civilians and perhaps help us better understand the stakes of war. Near the end of the event, Whitney asked the three about people who approached them to ask about their service and how we might talk to them about it. They agreed that they wanted to be defined by more than what they had done. One of the veterans said simply, "I want them to know me as a person." The humanities, I believe, can help us understand what it means to be a person, understand our common humanity, and in doing so, it can give voice to people like these veterans so that we, recalling Eli Wiesel's caution, do not fall back into silence. Now I want to introduce Lisa, who's going to talk about her project, that she is the driving force behind this theme, so take it away. And she has PowerPoint also.
I need to stand. I'm a professor after all, so I just feel like I'm on a morning talk show if I'm sitting there. My talk overlaps a little bit with what Brian was talking about, so it's going to sound a little bit more also evangelical about the humanities and how it's hard to monetize morality. We're living in liquid times. Today we experience change at unprecedented rates, often accompanied by feelings of fragility, impermanence, and vulnerability. A particular domain where we recognize the plasticity of modern life is through advancements in technology. Anyone who has flipped through the latest issue of Consumer Reports has likely stumbled upon articles glorifying the latest in smart technology, voice recognition, GPS software, navigation apps. Yet nowhere is there a mention of what all this technological development means for the state of our humanity. Where are the articles asking how all of this advancement is going to influence our basic human rights, security, information, privacy? Where are the reservoirs of human inquiry asking whether or not our Pokemon Go accounts could be subpoenaed? Or what it means when we create robots as companions for our aging population? Or when we apply the logic of convenience and efficiency to romantic partnerships, judging our satisfaction with one another based on availability. The good news is that these questions are being asked. They're being asked in the humanities. Brian referenced a crisis in the humanities. To me, if interest in the humanities is dwindling, that ought to serve as a canary in the coal mine of human consciousness. Forget about a crisis in the humanities. We'll have a crisis in humanity. As a communication studies professor and advisor, I'm approached frequently by students who are interested but apprehensive about a communication studies major. And I usually give them some sort of quip about the atom bomb that goes something like this. We need more people studying the implications of our technological development. We know how to harness nuclear energy. We did that over 7 years ago, but we're still struggling over whether, who, if ever, when it's acceptable to use it. So these are the types of questions that humanities scholars thrive on. And I want to be clear that this isn't to say that the humanities are more important than the sciences. We need the sciences. We wouldn't enjoy the quality of life we have today without the STEM fields. So it's not a competition. Humanities scholars are not against science. Rather, we recognize that we are and forever should be with science, or in Latin, conscience. Conscience. That is what we strive to teach, study, and cultivate in our programs. Conscience. This is why there's room in every field and every domain of life for a little dose of the humanities. Imagine how creative and analytically robust a computer science major would be if she took courses in my department where we deeply engage with the implications and the challenges faced by these new networked digital platforms, the same platforms that she's learning to code in her computer science classes. A recent example of this need for a balanced perspective came up in the news a few weeks back. That iconic Vietnam War image of Kim Phuc, or you might remember her as the Napalm Girl, the then naked 9-year-old fleeing napalm bombs during the war. It was flagged and taken down by Facebook for nudity. The problem was fixed and the image was restored, but to me the problem is really that we're using digital algorithms in situations that require human judgment. And cases like this one, to me, influence the need for a humanities perspective. With fewer and fewer limitations on what we can do, it places new emphasis on what we should do. Students in communication studies learn what I call actionable empathy through the art of rhetorical invention. They're becoming moral leaders equipped to act in the face of uncertainty, to uncover common ground, and to find a way out of no way. As the ancient Greek rhetorician Gorgias put it, I know the irreconcilable conflicts, and yet I act. Our students acquire the skills to study, embrace, and fearlessly confront the ambiance of uncertainty that characterizes our liquid lives today. They developed critical skills in contemplation, interpretation, and imagination. With a thorough understanding of how language shapes our perceptions of reality, students in communication studies can navigate the mysterious seas of human thought. They get a firm grasp on the relationship between language and knowledge. They can see how language engenders thought and how thought implies action. By studying communication and language use, the students both ask and answer, how did we get here? And where might we go? To be sure, all of us face new challenges and decisions for our collective future. What kind of world do we want to build? Communication studies, along with the other programs in the humanities, enable public dreaming about what the future could look like. Up to this point, my personal research has centered on one of the most fundamental threats to our existence, war. My disciplinary outlook views communication as a process of social influence. So my research questions tend to center on how are humans influenced or motivated to war. And this could be war in the literal sense with professional armies and artillery, or it can be war in a more everyday sense where we square off against people who are unlike us, who disagree with us, or who we simply don't understand. In other words, I study the process of turning adversaries into enemies, and how with a more supple communication perspective, we might be able to soften those attitudes and start to transcend difference. More specifically, I wrote a book last year called Friended at the Front, and it takes a human-centered view of what these wars look like. I went to bases in Okinawa and San Diego to interview active duty Marines about how they use social media during their deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I moved through a process much like the ones I teach my students to move through: contemplation, interpretation, imagination. I asked questions a communication studies scholar would ask. So I began with contemplation. What's going on here? Well, no one's writing letters anymore. Everybody is on social media. All right, so what kind of communication practices are they engaging in? What words, stories, photos are they sharing, and who are they sharing with, and when? Then I moved to interpretation. What do I make of it? What's the historical context? How is this different from previous wars? What are the implications of the new communication context? And finally, imagination. What's the impact on the common good? What do we learn about war from all this digital exhaust? What does war look like when it's presented this way? And how might other forms of representation do a better job? So these are the types of questions communication studies scholars ask. How do we make meaning of our lives, and how does communication shape what is knowable about the world around us? As the Marines from my first study transition out of the military, I've also made a transition in my own work to the post-war experience. What types of messages do veterans create about their war experiences? Who do they communicate them to? How do they want to be remembered? And how would the broader public remember these wars? My preliminary work has led me to an early and obvious conclusion. Veterans could very well be the most thoughtful and worthy sages that our generation could turn to understand the nature of our humanity. Their service experiences and war experiences often render them true humanists. And this goes for veterans of the most recent wars and veterans of our most distant wars. I have an example of the critical wit offered by a veteran whose legs were taken from him by an IED blast when he was just 19 years old. He's now in his early 20s, and his Facebook post, shown here with his consent and his identity protected, references the recent public attention paid to the Kaepernick issue. So for those of you who have managed to avoid it, Kaepernick is the American football player who remains seated or doesn't stand during the national anthem. And so here you can see he says, "I've been sitting through the national anthem for years and no one seems to care." What a mature and educative perspective. And this is why I've pushed for our attention on the veterans. They have so much to offer us. So one way you could frame Gonzaga's Public Humanities initiative is that we want to bring serviceable scholarship to our community. Of course we want to do that. But another way that you could imagine it, and I think that this might be the more genuine of the two, given my colleagues up here, is that we want the Spokane and broader Washington community to influence and improve our work. How can we enrich our lives and community? Where might we collaborate? And how can we broaden and live out Gonzaga's mission to be people for people? The answer, of course, to me, lies in the public humanities. It's the most holistic response to the challenges facing our contemporary world. Engaging veterans, students, and student veterans in humanities-based inquiry will supply a comforting sense of buoyancy in the face of this century's unique challenges. Perhaps it's fitting for me to wrap up by invoking the words of a veteran, General Omar Bradley, who in 1948 said, "We've grasped the mystery of the atom and rejected the Sermon on the Mount. The world has achieved brilliance without wisdom, power without conscience. Ours is a world of nuclear giants and ethical infants." Since those words in 1948, we've dived deeper into the complexities associated with scientific and technological advancement. I can think of no better response than to refocus our attention, energy, and resources to the humanities so they can continue to grow with science.
Yeah, Anna Marie, who's again one of the sort of forerunners of this project. Go ahead.
Hi. I don't have prepared words, but I'll tell you a little story about how this all got started. So in 2006, I'm teaching a general psych class in a room sort of like this, and there's this kid, and he sits, and he looks like he's 12, and he's wearing the ROTC uniform, and I see him every day of class, and I'm driving home one day, and I hear about this terrible attack that killed so many troops, and I think, these kids are going to die. These kids in our class, why aren't we talking about this? Why aren't we talking about the fact that they're going to get thrown into these situations and we're not talking about it? And so I was really troubled by this. But you know, I've got kids, so I didn't do a whole lot. And I mentioned it to a friend of mine in history, saying, you know, we're not talking about the fact that we've got these kids in our classroom who are going to go to war, you know. And he said, yeah, we should. I don't know why nobody's doing anything about it. And so we did this for several weeks, like, nobody's doing anything about it. I'm like, we should do something about this. So we started talking, well, what would we do? This is my friend Eric Cunningham in history. And he's like, well, let's talk to some other people. So we ended up talking to Jeff Dodd in English and John Eliason in English and other folks in the humanities. And we're like, well, let's just get together and start talking about what would we ask people. And my first job out of college was working at a vet center in Menlo Park for people who have PTSD. I was just a research assistant on a project. But you absorb stuff when you work at a place. And one of the things that struck me was that a lot of the people who worked there were also veterans. And their stories weren't like, I had this image of the Vietnam veteran in my head, right, that I'd just gotten over time. But their stories weren't like this veteran image I had. They were as individual as the individuals who had them. And the one thing that seemed consistent was they said, well, nobody really wants to talk about this stuff. Nobody, he's like, who do you talk about this? I get talking with one guy, he's like, well, yeah, I was there and it was a drag. And he's like, you know when you enter a room, somebody else who's been there. He's like, but nobody else gets it, so you just you just go along and you package it up and you set it up on the shelf. And I thought, well, that is just shame. That's just a shame. And so with that experience and then talking to all these folks in the humanities, I thought, well, maybe we should talk about what it's like to come home. They have their own experiences there, but how do you make sense of something that's that disruptive? How do you come back to this world where, I'm pretty much unaffected by the fact that we've been involved in these 2 wars and we've got troops in Iraq right now fighting ISIS and more on the way. That doesn't touch my day-to-day life. Somebody said, oh, well, your taxes went up. I'm like, yeah, but you just pay those. You don't think about it. So my civic duty is voting. That's all I'm doing. So I think that sense of, like, if we're all in this together, we should all be helping people who are really in it for us. So we all got together and we came up with this series of questions, and we should just start talking to people and interviewing them. So I'm in psychology, and every time you want to do a study in psychology, you have to run it through the Institutional Review Board, and that's just kind of my mode. So I'm like, well, we have to get this approved. And my friends in the humanities were like, what? And I said, well, we just don't want to. We want to give people like a list of resources if our talking to them upsets them. And they're like, oh, yeah. So we got it approved. And so then we just got started, and we weren't terribly creative about who we invited. I invited the ROTC cadre because they were right there. And they knew people. And then I had a student in class whose husband had done 2 tours in Iraq. So I said, do you think he'd mind talking? And so it turned out he worked at a recruiting office. And so we interviewed a lot of his colleagues, and they knew people, and that's kind of how it grew. And I think those of us who ended up doing the interviews were so moved, again, just by the variety of experiences and what people took from them, that we were saying we should use these in our classrooms. There wasn't a lot of identifying information, and we didn't use names. And so I use them in my classroom, and when I talk about emotion. I teach a seminar on emotion, and we talk about emotion regulation. And so I use these because some of these guys and some of these women were like, here's how you deal with it, and here's how you don't deal with it, and here's what you do when you can't figure out how to deal with it. And that was compelling to me. A friend of mine in religious studies used some of the interviews to illustrate things for his class. So I thought, well, this is really what we need to be doing. If we really are part of this community, if we're community engaged, we need to have our thinking. We need to listen to people who are going to war for us. We need to hear what that experience is like and help them make sense of it. Not that we have any idea, those of us who haven't been, what it's like, but there's this gap, right? There was this gap between people who went to war and the rest of us. And I think it's kind of incumbent on the rest of us who benefit by these people going to war to go, okay, so we don't know, and I know you may not know how to tell it, but let's just create this space where I'll ask you some questions, and like a lot of the times we would ask questions and the answers would be all over the place, right? They were all sort of tied together, the thought was tied together, but it seems like when we try to understand our experiences, we try to tie them to what we know, right? So something happens, and it's not just the thing that happens in the story you tell, but it reminds you of other things, and the way its meaning affects you is tied to other events. And so a lot of the stories that we got from people were tied to these specific events, and I think it just helped them figure out what that was, right? They just spent 13 months, or if they got extended 15 or 16 months, or several tours. They're just trying to figure out what was that. In fact, one guy just said, he's like, he called me and said, I'd like to come back and do it again. It was about 15 months later. I'm like, yeah, that'd be great. And he's like, it's just, I'm just trying to figure out what that was. I said, no, that's fine. I think in our society we have this idea that, veterans come back and they're either fine and they adjust, or they have PTSD. And it's like there's a whole lot of suffering that's not easily categorized that we should listen to, right? If they're carrying this burden on our behalf, maybe we should listen to it. And I think that it's not clear how to do that, right? So I can't remember if it was your quote or Todd's quote, but we're stumbling forward with good intentions, and we're hoping that it's helpful, and we're hoping that we can learn something about who we are as humans in living in a community by doing this. So that's what the project is. We started it pretty much in December of 2010, and we have about 42 interviews. Things sort of got derailed for a while, but a bunch of us were overtaken by events. But couldn't have been more pleased by Brian approaching and talking about it, because I want people to listen to these. We had students transcribe these, and then we would have other students check the transcripts to make sure that they were accurate. And it's just, I think it was our way of trying to get people aware of the fact that other people their age are having these experiences, right? The world's much bigger than your set of experiences. And I can say that, and people can nod and go, yeah, but to actually listen to someone who's had a completely different set of experiences is a very different thing. So I couldn't be more delighted by the work that Lisa and Brian and Kathleen are doing, because it feels like, as our own academic community, we're really trying to connect with people who serve us, right? And understand them and help them understand themselves maybe.
Kathleen Jeffs from theater, who's working with the oral histories, right?
Right, so this is kind of the next step for an erase project is what my classroom is up to now. So I'm Kathleen Jeffs, and I chair the theater and dance department here at Gonzaga, and I also teach playwriting and theater history and acting classes. And my playwriting class right now, that's operational this fall, they are just finishing up their 10-minute plays. So on our season card, which I'll hand out relentlessly at the end, one of our things we want to do is have our students write work. They stage work by other established playwrights, but we also want them to be writers and stage their own work. So that's what they're doing right now. So you can come tonight and see some of their 10-minute plays at 7:30 or tomorrow at 2 over in the Magnuson Theater in College Hall. But as they move out of that, away from Fall Family Weekend and into October and November, they're moving into an oral histories project, which is their next step. And that's where they're literally taking the interviews that Anna Marie has curated and dividing them up among the 12 of them. So they're each taking about 4 or 5, and they're supposed to very thoughtfully and slowly listen through them and take notes in a very specific way. And then throughout a period of kind of collective creation, we're going to turn that work into a play. And my colleague Charlie Pepitone is going to direct that play, and it will be in our main stage season, so it will eventually become part of our season card as it goes along. So something that's really important to me with this project is to honor the work of the people who have served, and also to honor the work of the student writers who are engaging and experiencing that vicariously through the interviews, and to honor that perception as well, and to kind of marry those through this piece of art. So what does that mean for my students? My students will play a key role in the development of the play's genesis and early writing process, and they're serving directly as research assistants and apprentices. So we're going to use an established method of playwriting, of kind of writing practice that the students will get to learn So they've kind of thrown up their 10-minute play this weekend, right? But they haven't yet gone through like a kind of established new writing process, and that's what I want them to do here, is to learn a professional practice. And through that, the main artistic focus of the work then is to look at the gaps in perception between people who've served and those who haven't. So everyone already knows that someone who's been to war sees the world differently than someone who's not. But how does this work on the micro, local level of experiences and our students at Gonzaga? So literally sitting into a classroom with these 230 current students on the GI Bill, when the people in that room are experiencing something very different, although their sensory input is the same. So some examples of that kind of input and how those experiences resonate differently would be like the sounds of the bells of St. Al's. Something that people talk about is having different resonances. For people who have served, it can sometimes recall to their minds the Muslim call to prayer that they would hear at regular intervals in a very different international context, whereas someone who hasn't had that experience has a very Catholic, way of hearing that bell and a response in their heart that can be different. So one of our first steps in kind of gathering those experiences and getting language to talk about some of these perceptions is to go for walks. So we're talking with Alan and other of our friends who have served, and we're saying, will you come for a walk with us around campus? Will you come with my class and just go outside and experience things like bulldozers? Because right now, our campus is excitingly full of bulldozers. But that resonates differently for people who've experienced those in different contexts. And there are also other things on campus that we don't even know about. Like you said, the stories are individual to humans, because each individual human is unique. And so the stories that we hear about perceptions at Gonzaga vary a lot. And that's kind of where I wanted to start, was with perceptions of the senses. So the play then will use these practical, actual sensations to create a fictional environment on the stage that brings the audience into these two shared but separate realities. And my goal is to honor those who've served by presenting the play as an exploration of some of the human aspects of deployment, return, and life at Gonzaga after service. So it involves a lot of collaboration and interdisciplinary work on campus. On October 18th, Anna Marie and also Heather Easterling are coming to my playwriting class. So Heather Easterling teaches in English and teaches a How to Tell a True War Story class, which I learned about through this project. And we kind of want them in our classrooms talking with the students, talking about the multidisciplinary approaches, so her class can come and learn with my class about these interviews. Because like she said, she wants as many people to hear them as possible, and for them to be used in a variety of ways, artistic and otherwise. So that's something that we're going to do. I also think it's important to speak with our students about the ethics of working with interviews and actual material, verbatim material that comes from humans. You said you have to run it through your professional board. We have to run it also through an ethical process of, is this person given their consent for this information to be used in this way, for their experience to be made into a play or a moment in a play. So we're going to go through the kind of ethics and practicalities of that. And then there's the kind of practical way, well, how do you do it? How do you write a play based on these interviews? And one of the collective creation methods that we use is to use a lot of 3x5 cards. So as they're listening, they take a lot of 3x5 cards, and on one side, they transpose very carefully and very accurately verbatim lines that they've heard that have resonated for them about the senses. And on the other side, they'll write structure, action, motivation, subtext. They'll write dramatic kind of theory kind of words about what dramatic elements they think this moment in this person's life might be useful for in a piece of theater. So that way they can kind of stack the cards in different ways. They can write scenes and develop fiction out of some things that are real, respecting the verbatim nature of some of the words. Okay, and then out of that they have to kind of select from their cards 3 good stories. We don't start with the stories, we start with the perceptions, but if you then look for story within, you can then start to weave stories together. Because like I was saying to Anna Marie before this session, if you read for events and you read for kind of plot and great anecdotes and good material first, the stories all kind of start to sound the same. There's a lot of similarity in stories that people tell, but if you start with human perception and then build story, you get something different that's more unique. So I think it honors the individuals more to start with their individual perceptions. So that's why we do that. And then the students then who are in the class, they consistently need to write paragraphs and prose about what they're experiencing reading and listening to these and going for these walks, and so that their perception is part of the play too. I think there should be characters in the play who are students who are non-vets, so that that perspective is also a character in the work. So that it's not just like, what was it like to be there, but it's also like, what is it like to be here now? So I'll kind of end there by saying that there's a kind of a quest structure to the deployment and return narrative or narrative arc that is very dramatic structure. And we're kind of looking at that, and we're also playing against that a little bit. We don't want it to feel just like that kind of return from home after something that you're trying to internalize and grapple with, and then what happens now, and some kind of feeling of unity. That play's already been written, we know that story. So to kind of cut against that, we're looking at transitional moments. You know, those moments on the bus when you're waiting to either get home or get to the place where you've been deployed to. We're looking for transitional moments of, you know, lots and lots of smoking, and lots of waiting, and lots of kind of fight clubs and things that come out to dissipate tension. Things that were talked about at Whitney Terrell's event the other night, that were just really helpful human ways people deal with those transitions. So rather than focusing on the natural arc of deployment and return, we're looking at those moments in between. So that's something else to know about the play. And then how will it all end? It'll end with a script treatment by the end of the semester. So that's my job, is to create something at the end that's a product, a document that I can hand to Charlie. And Charlie then will take it into a devised theater process. So he won't get a finished script from me in December. He'll get something that he can take in rehearsal and start another process of collective creation, which is devised theater. So he's going to start then to rehearse something. He'll cast, he'll have an ensemble, but he won't have every word yet that that ensemble will speak and every action that they will do. The process of creation will continue in rehearsal. And the reason I think it's important to use that method to rehearse this play is because we don't know yet how those students that are in that ensemble, how this material resonates with them. They're going to be telling other people's stories, but it's also important that they're telling their story of how that this experience kind of sits in their heart and what their experience is. And we want that to be part of the play. And until we know who those actors are, we don't have that story. And they may need to go for new walks, and they may need to have new material because they're different humans. So that's the project and what's kind of coming next. So I'd say thanks very much. I'd also say we're doing a backstage tour of the theater at 4. So if anyone's free at 4 o'clock, they can come over to the Magnuson Theater, walk around, see what we're up to, and then at 7:30, watch some 10-minute plays written by the 10-minute playwriters in the class and acted by student actors. So thanks.
We're sorry to press up against time, but if people have any questions, if any of us, we'd be happy to answer them. Comments, it's a public thing, so we want to hear from you also as well. I think all of us are cognizant of the fact that none of us are veterans, but we, that event we had the other night, one of the veterans, I met with him early, and it was actually a very frightening story, because I said, will you read this book and tell this author who's coming what you think of this book? Because we think that it'll give us some sense of what it's like to be a veteran, and actually a group of veterans all said, no, you'll never know. And it's in the sense, it's very interesting. Everyone I've ever spoken to, I think you said this as well, the smell. There's the smell. And so many veterans, it's the first thing they talk about. There's a smell. And of course, we can never get that. But at the end of the process, the student veterans all read the book and said, it's pretty good, actually. It's pretty close. A lot of this really does reflect our experience. So I think it's about the bridge. We know we're never going to know, but we can be closer, maybe. So if there are no questions, oh, excellent, Colonel.
Good morning. Without words, I simply want to say, I'd like to express gratitude for what you all are doing, and also for you folks to be here to listen to this very important part of our world. Less than 1/2 of 1% of our nation is in uniform during this time of persistent conflict, and we have an all-volunteer force that's worked very well since 1973, so people that are stepping forward, I mean, they're talented, the scholar, athlete leaders in the Bulldog Battalion, they want to do something for our country and bigger than themselves. And there's much purpose in my life to be around them, make them faster, stronger, smarter. And in any case, what you are doing to connect all of us, I mean, it's very American, it's very much what our closest allies have in mind. We play roles, it's very Gonzaga-like, and Jesuit-like, and Zag-like, to listen and learn and move forward and be stronger in the future. And I've not expressed gratitude enough to what you've been doing for a while, but thank you from the bottom of my heart. This is exactly what I think the founders had in mind as we move forward and take care of one another. We've got challenges that we need to confront, and there's so many resources, and so we're all in this together, and so thank you. And buy Lisa's book, it's good. I read it. I mean, it's insightful, and it really helps gain understanding and make meaning, and you know, real American people that are sharing their things. That Lisa did such a beautiful job putting together, so thank you.
I think the work that you're doing is incredibly valuable. Valuable from the perspective of the reentry back, how difficult that is, how difficult it is to actually tell the story. I think it's illustrative of a young mind to be able to see that there are differences, especially in the walking around and how the perspective is different from the veteran's perspective. You know, a lot of veterans are really trying to get at that question, what happened here? You know, what happened to me here? And how does that relate to what I'm doing now? What I want to communicate to the next generation of what happened here. So that's been an incredibly difficult story to tell. Much of World War II veterans never wanted to talk about it. Vietnam veterans struggled with it because their reentry back was so difficult, so tough. And the acceptance of it in our society and the acceptance of those veterans have been very difficult. So I applaud you. I think it's valuable work. And definitely gives us a new perspective on what it is to be human.
One more, yeah, we'll take one more.
Just very quick, and in your work, please keep in mind the breadth of your study. From the veteran who comes back faster, smarter, for life, and the veteran who comes back troubled, at the other end of that spectrum, and everybody in between.
Thank you. Yes.
Well, thank you again, everybody, for coming out. We appreciate it. Do make sure you go to the 10-Minute Theater. It's fantastic. Our theater department is doing incredible work, just incredible work. So please do that. And otherwise, have a great weekend. There are a lot of programs. Enjoy yourselves, and we'll be up here if you have any further questions. Thank you.